Okay, our next interview is with someone who is not a member of the ABAA, but who knows more about the ABAA than probably anybody else alive. Is the ABAA's very competent, very able, very bright attorney, Larry Fox. Larry, it's great to have you here. And what I'd like you to first do is tell the people how you got involved in books and as a collector, etc., and then float that over to becoming the first real full-time ABAA attorney.
Thanks, Mike. I'd love to. How did I start? I was always a book collector. I mean, back in college, I always loved reading and therefore would always gravitate toward bookstores. And in fact, when I went to law school, I actually worked at a bookstore, and I went to talk to the gentleman that owned it. His name was Sam Yutkin, and he said, well, do you have a graduate degree? I said, no, I'm in law school. I haven't graduated yet. He said, well, do you have a PhD? I said, no. He said, well, you know, we only have people who work here who already have graduate degrees. I said, but I'm willing to work for books, to be paid in books. He says, you're hired. So I actually worked at a bookstore and got paid in books. And then continued my legal career, and then ultimately came to New York. And when I was in New York, I continued collecting books and would always go to 4th Avenue and all the bookstores up in the Upper West Side where I live. And I was at a large litigation firm doing antitrust litigation. They did international work. And I was never a person that would go out to lunch. I was just a hardworking, just keep going. And other people would go out to lunch, the other associates, and I wouldn't. But periodically, I just needed to break. So I'd leave the offices, which were at 59th and 5th, and I'd take a walk over to the Argosy bookstore. And I would spend my 45 minutes spelunking around the bookstores, up in the stacks, talking to Mr. Cohn, talking to his daughters, and periodically coming back with books under my arm. So a partner came over to me and says, Larry, what's your story? You don't go to lunch, you work hard. But when you go out, you go by yourself, and you come back with books. What's your story? I told him about my book passion. He goes, oh. He says, you know, I represent a client, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. These people are bright, idiosyncratic, and they're driving me crazy. How would you, Larry, like to be the lawyer for the ABAA? I said, are you kidding? I would love to. He says, they're yours. So I immediately was like a kid in a candy store. I took all the papers, I read all the bylaws, the historical documents for the association, the tax documents, and then I'm ushered in and meet Larry Whitten in 1979.
That was your first president that you worked with?
Yes, was Larry Whitten in 1979. I've had 34 years. This year is my 34th year. I've worked for 17 presidents.
Me included.
You included, 88 to 90, exactly. But 34 presidents. This is like more than half of my life, 90% of my legal career, or 95%. I've been a lawyer since 1973, so you could figure out the math there. And it's more than half of the life of the association, and have served over 500 board members and been at every board meeting since 1979.
Nobody knows the history of the association
more
than you do.
So you're talking about the repository of the historical walking knowledge of the ins, the outs, the ups, the downs, and the sideways of the growth of this great, great organization, which I love. So that's how I began. In 1979, the partner asking me to work and me meeting Larry Whitten. And Larry was this, wonderful, avuncular gentleman. And you know in his head, he's saying, how did I wind up from this senior partner at this big firm with this eager kid? And I always said, Larry knew what was going on. And he totally understood, because my enthusiasm was communicated to him, that I would be a dedicated and committed attorney, as well as had the passion for the book side of the business. And that's how 34 years ago this all began.
See if your memory is probably very good, but let's start with Larry Whitten and see if you can, in the next 15 to 20 minutes, bring us through all those presidents, but not necessarily all of them. Talk a little bit about some of the big things that you had to work with, some of the major issues that were of great concern to the association, and some of the disappointments and some of the triumphs.
Okay. Well, I think, to me, one of the seminal moments in the organization's history was under the aegis of Betty Woodburn. And, this is the beauty of the ABAA is, to me, is the core is its ethical guidelines. And it melds the fact that we are an organization and a profession that has ethics. And yet it's a business, and we're in a trade, but it has professional guidelines that guides how we are to interact with our customers and the outside community. And I think that really has been and continues to be the highlight of what this organization is all about. But your ethical guidelines are only as good as your willingness to stand up and enforce them. And Betty Woodburn was the first president to really be tested in this regard. And we had a situation where probably one of the wealthiest members of the association, extremely well-heeled financially, acted in manners that was not consistent with our ethical guidelines. And the association took the tough position after a hearing, an opportunity to be heard, and I'm very proud of having instituted in the organization a set of procedures for fair hearings. And the decision being taken for the first time to expel a member from the association for violating the ethical guidelines. And this member said, I will bankrupt this association. I will take this association down, and sued the ABAA for Sherman antitrust violations, claiming that he was expelled because the board were his competitors and wanted to deprive him of access to the valuable fairs that we had, and therefore took this to injure him in his competition. And we didn't have money. The association
I remember.
had very little money. And this guy's threat was, I don't care how long it takes, I don't care how much money, I have all the money I need, I will bankrupt this association. And Betty Woodburn was tough and was faced with a very difficult choice. Fight to death and potentially kill the organization that had been alive since 1949, or stand tough and stand up for what's right. And she ultimately made that tough decision. And we ultimately litigated the case, went to trial, won, and had every dime of the association's attorney's fees paid by the other side. And after that, created a legal fund that sits aside to tell the outside world that never again will this association be faced with the dire prospect of not being able to defend its ethical guidelines. And I'm proud to say, from that moment to this, we've never had to litigate again the willingness to enforce our guidelines. So I think Betty stands out in my mind. Every association president, from Lou to Lou Weinstein, yourself, Michael, Peter Howard, everyone had their own way of organizing the association. But one thing that united every president was their commitment to the organization and to working with the Board of Governors to advance the association's goals, both domestically and internationally. I think Bob Fleck stands out in my mind as a person that just took a stand with respect to wanting to move with ILAB. We had very difficult international relations for a very long time. And we either were going to break. There was a time when people talked about breaking.
I remember vividly. That
we don't, why are we doing this? Why are we giving 10% of our booth fare? What are we getting? We're excluded from membership. Not from membership, but
from certain fairs.
Yeah, or from even the positions on the executive committee or acting as an officer of those organizations. Right. And through Rob Rulon Miller, Bob Fleck, others, we slowly moved toward a recognition of what we had to offer. We convinced our European colleagues of the willingness to work together collaboratively to move the international book trade forward. And I think that we've never had better relations than we do today. I think Priscilla Javelis, helped move us toward the internet and much more involvement with expanding our reach on the internet and dealing with a variety of different, not only technical issues, but ethical issues. You know, people just cribbing other people's catalogs. What are the copyright issues? What are our guidelines with respect to copyright issues? So in every 2 years, every president brings to the organization their views on both their historical knowledge of the business, their business acumen, but also their commitment to the organization and working within the organization. So that, to me, is what has distinguished this organization and all of its representatives, the committees that work so hard, the board of governors that work so hard, and obviously the officers. I think very few people who haven't served have an appreciation for the time commitment.
I don't think any of the rank and file members really realize how much goes in to becoming an officer or just even a board member.
Absolutely.
It's a tremendous commitment, not only in time, but there's a lot of soul searching that has to go with it.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more. What are some of the other things that stand out in your mind for 34 years of being our counsel?
Well, I mean, the ethical guidelines, to me, the growth of, the financial capabilities of the organization. I mean, we used to be a fairly ragtag group where the chapters viewed the national as an encumbrance, as an entity that was either trying to unnecessarily extend their power into local issues. It was a microcosm for federalism.
Yeah, really.
It was, if you really look back on the Federalist Papers, and what were the founding fathers and thinking about when they talked about centralized government versus diffuse government? Those are the issues that this organization grappled with when we have chapters and local chapters, and why were dues going to the national? And all the local chapters had their own budgets, and they kept their money. So they would get their book fair money and husband the book fair money.
That's right.
I remember situations where we could not get the books and records of certain chapters. They were holding it from us.
Yeah.
Because they were afraid the national would glom it. Yeah, so these were huge issues that could have been enormously divisive. And then passing rules that said all the money comes to national. Then we budget it out based upon need, based upon historical needs, based upon what it is you want to do as a chapter. There is nothing that we will say you can't do. The question is, let's think about what's wise.
Yeah.
And how does it advance the organization's principles and its goals?
Well, that's also was a sore spot for a lot of people at that time, because a lot of the chapters felt like that. They felt as though the national was trying to take away their money so that they couldn't do anything. They didn't understand what the big picture was. And I think to a certain extent, a couple of chapters still feel the same way. And I don't think that's going to change. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, over the years, there have been a lot of different board members. And my question to you is, what percentage of the younger people in our trade are becoming board members or are serving? It used to be all the old timers who did all the work and got all the energy, and there were very few young people who were involved. I have the feeling that there are far more young people now that are participating.
Well, as I age, the definition of young has changed.
I'm talking about...
We were all young, Mike, when we were doing this.
I remember that, I think.
88, you were on the board, you were president.
I was
a young man.
I was on the board in 70-something, so 40 years ago. But I'm talking about the 35 to 50-year-old group, as opposed to the 50-plus-year-old group. Yeah,
I'd say it's still more predominantly the older group. And I think that there's got to be more and more mentoring going on. I walk around the fairs and I keep looking for young dealers.
Yeah.
I keep looking for what can we do and what's the approach, both educationally and through mentoring, to get people into this business. My biggest concern is that this age gap and the way the business is conducted is more and more toward an internet, and therefore
Yeah.
you have less connoisseurship.
Yeah.
And therefore, people who are collectors and young people with money tend to have been buying and selling online. The idea of being guided, the idea of advisors is really something that young people have not really become attached to. They think either they know it all because they're hot and they're smart and they're educated, therefore they know more than anyone. And the idea that this is a knowledge profession, this is a profession where people need guidance. You don't go into and build real collections without relying on the wisdom and the experience of knowledgeable dealers.
I see an awful lot of the European dealers who are here appear to be much younger than the American dealers who are here. I wonder if that's a trend that's going to cross the ocean.
I don't know. I think I have no basis for understanding how the transitions occur in these different countries, the transition of wealth, to what extent these are family businesses.
Yeah.
I know Irving Zucker was a dear friend, and his whole family I know, and I know his grandson is in the business.
Is that Matthew?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I had the good fortune of interviewing Irving a month before he died.
Oh.
And it was an interview that we'll never forget because he started talking and he didn't stop talking for 35 minutes. He started in 1933 and went all the way up to 2000 or whatever. But let me ask you another question, Larry, as someone who's been with the organization for all these many years. What do you see as the future of our organization? Do you see us as a viable entity going into 10, 20, 30 years into the future?
I do. I think the only threat that I see is the aging population and the new blood coming in and the recognition that shows, I think, will always be important. And as long as shows are important, we're the preeminent shows, we have a raison d'etre of continuing. Two, I think the more and more people are used to the internet, the more people will become, in the next few years, knowledgeable that the internet is the Wild West. There's information overload.
Yeah.
And you cannot assess yourself the value of that information. So I think slowly people are going to be more cognizant of the fact that they should not be making important judgments based on, this is like going to WebMD and deciding whether you have a disease.
I think it might be easier though.
Well, you could certainly start to say to yourself, this could be one of these 10 things, maybe it's 5, but am I going to make a judgment as to whether that's a hernia or just, some bad thing? No, I'm going to go to the doctor. So somebody could look at the internet and float around and decide, 18th century American pamphlets, Revolutionary War material is interesting to me. Who are the dealers in this area? They can narrow their focus and then seek those people out. It's kind of what's happening now where, people learn about something on the net and then want to go physically touch it.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. The next question is, in a visual-oriented society, how can people buy things without physically examining them? I know a lot of dealers have pictures, but a picture is one thing, and picking it up is yet another thing. And another issue that I want to talk to you about, when you first started in this, as a counsel for the organization, this town had hundreds of bookstores where you could go on 4th Avenue and you could spend the whole damn day going from bookstore to bookstore to bookstore. Now, they're all gone. I mean, what does the book collector do if not the internet? What else?
That's true. I used to absolutely go up and down 4th Avenue, and I live on the Upper West Side in New York.
Yeah.
And there was this little bookstore called The Griffin, and I literally would I would put my kids to bed, finish work, have dinner with my wife, put the kids to bed, and at 9:30, go to The Griffin.
Yeah.
And from 9:30 to 11:30 or 12, hang out in the bookstore.
Yeah.
There are people on the Upper West Side today who think I work at that bookstore.
Bookstore.
And now that bookstore moved down to like 81st Street, which is right across the street from where I work. So I know all those guys. I go in there all the time. It's this little narrow secondhand bookstore. And I hang out there, I look at books, I talk to them. And my history was every town I went to, wherever I traveled throughout business, I'd always go to bookstores. And if I went in and spent time looking around and couldn't find anything, I would always leave a couple of dollars.
Yeah.
Just saying, thank you for
being here.
Thank you for, and I always wanted us to try to find a kind of a sympathetic congressman or senator to try to see if we could get a bill passed, either for state or federal, that to somehow create tax incentives for people to be in this business. So because it's First Amendment, it really does have a First Amendment component to it, and just the importance of booksellers is something that we need to protect. It's like an endangered species that needs protection, and we should be thinking about legislative approaches to doing that. But I do think in the end, the association has an important future, and I think the way to that future is the ABA logo to be branded, and that anyone could, I always said, shop online, look, but when you decide to buy from an ABAA member, because they have the experience, the knowledge, they've been vetted to become a member, and there's ethical guidelines. And that is what we should be promoting.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Have you had many problems with people illegally using our logo?
Not many, but we
some
are
have tried.
vigilant. And oh yeah, there are people who put the ABA on their cards or on their window. And when we learn of it, we send them cease and desist orders, and we follow up. We haven't had to sue anyone, but we have a very vigorous program to make sure that if we identify somebody using it on the net or on physical bricks and mortar property, we pursue it vigorously.
What are some, before I let you go, Larry, what are some of the issues that we're going to be looking at in the next administration? John Thompson of Bartleby's Books, a terrific guy, a hard worker. I think he's going to be a great president. What are some of the issues you're going to have to be dealing with in the next couple of years?
Well, I think the security issues are issues that will remain with us. I think as long as collectors view both personally, they want to have things, whether the value or not, and are willing to take things out of libraries. I think libraries have to become much more vigilant about protecting the materials. Part of the problem that we have with the dissemination of materials that are problematic is that libraries are very chary about letting the world know when materials have walked out their door.
Right.
Because they don't want donors to be concerned about donating material.
And they don't want to lose their jobs either.
And it's becoming more difficult when somebody all of a sudden surfaces and says, oh, that manuscript was something I owned. It was stolen from me 20 years ago. And then what's the proof that's required?
Yeah.
So I think security issues will remain. I think people are going to be tempted to put things on the internet and have fake signatures on it. And therefore, legitimate dealers are going to be competing with dealers that are less than savory. And our legitimate dealers are at a competitive disadvantage because it's a lot easier to sell a fake signed book that's a first edition than an actually signed presentation.
Because of the price.
So I think our security issues will remain for ongoing. I think our growth on the internet is very important to our future, and I see the next 2 years as 2 years where we really come into our own with good websites, good interaction, and a site that is one that attracts lots of visitors and helps our members sell books.
Last question, Larry. Over the past 5 to 10 years, I've seen a lot of replevin cases that are coming, and booksellers who have things that they think are absolutely legitimately theirs because they've paid money, etc. And some library has come along and said, no, that belongs to the state of North Carolina, that belongs to the state of Texas. How are we as an association dealing with this kind of thing? Or are we?
Yeah, no, it's very difficult for an association to deal with it because they're really, those statutes are on the books. It is a legitimate claim when it is legitimate. The question is, when it's used for purposes to raise, basically raise tax revenues. In some instances, materials that legitimately were deaccessioned many, many years ago, and the institution doesn't have any records, they will shift or try to shift the burden to the holder to prove that they have provenance. And that's virtually impossible.
Right.
So now you have a standoff, and the question is who has the ultimate burden? And the cost of defending the property is prohibitive. So it's a extortionary problem because you're dealing with a government agency coming after you where they're using tax dollars, and it's your private dollars, and usually even if the value of the item is substantial, you're really talking about somewhere between maybe $10,000 and $30,000. It's not $1 million item, because usually those items do have a decent provenance. And from an organizational standpoint, it becomes a private matter, and we can't involve ourselves in private disputes because we're not the Legal Aid Society for booksellers. Although we'd like to be, and we try, we can only do so much.
Well, thanks very much, Larry. I appreciate you coming by, spending a little time with us, and talking about some of your memories of the association that you know more about than anybody in.
Well, I'll end by just saying I felt and feel extraordinarily privileged to have these 35 years and hopefully more to share with this great organization, which I have loved, and all the people. It's the relationships that I've built over these years that matter very, very much. And it's been an honor to be working for you when you were president and being part of this great organization.
Thank you, Larry.
Thanks.
Thank you.